So today we'll be continuing reading Capital's Grave by Jodi. We're going to be starting chapter 2. Forward can be backwards on transition and temporarily. Oh, on transition and temporarily. Sorry. Capital is turning into something that is no longer capitalist, where holders of wealth are compelled to follow different laws of motion, not competition, reinvestment, and improvement by predation, hoarding, and destruction. Capital is becoming neo-feudal. That is becoming means that we cannot say we are in a completely new period. It's not dead yet. We're in a period of transition. Oh, hi, Crimson. I forgot who you were again. Are you Gwendolyn? Anyway, sorry, I got a little distracted there. Capital is becoming neo-feudal. That is becoming means that we cannot say we are in a completely new period. It's not dead yet. We're in a period of transition, and transition can last a long, long time. The challenge is understanding transition while we're in it and aren't sure where we're going. Marxists have long grappled with the question of transition, whether debating the transition from feudalism to capitalism or considering how capitalism creates the opening of communism. Marxists generally approach the question as a problem of fundamental systematic change. How is social, political, and economic transformation possible? How does one kind of society and mode of production become another one? The question may be posted as the issue of stages of historical development and periods of revolutionary struggle. The determining dynamic of technological innovation, the alternative of reform and revolution, the role of the dictatorship of the proletariat, or even the classic political theory dilemma of how people who have grown up in the chains might build a free society. How did we get from oppression to freedom? Mackenzie Work's provocative question, what if we're not in capitalism anymore, but something worse, takes aim at stages assumptions, furthering left accounts of transition. 2. Many Marxists seem to assume a linear progression from slavery to feudalism, to capitalism to socialism, and towards communism. Since socialism has yet to be built, they conclude that we must still be in a capitalism. Blinkered by this underlying stagism, left analysis remain unable to theorize the present. They're trapped in the premise that just as the bourgeoisie defeated the feudal lords, so must the industrial proletariat defeat the bourgeoisie, and that capitalism will persist until it does. But what happens when the working class has lost? If capital is a relation, wouldn't that change capitalism into something else? But the presumptions of stagist Marxism prevent the question from even being posed. Something like neo-feudalism would be impossible for the onset and going backwards when history moves only forward. Fortunately, the Marxist transition has a richer, more complex approach to time and history than the old developmentalist story of linear stages. This tradition is important for the neo-feudal hypothesis because it demonstrates how labor forms, law of motion, laws of motion, modes of production, and accumulation strategies are never as pure as we imagine. The complex temporalities interwoven throughout Marxist theory allows for overlap and incompleteness. Processes associated with earlier modes of production conceding with those of later modes. Reversals and retrogressions subvert presumptions of straightforward march to a certain future. Development is uneven and extractable for de-development. Features associated with one period or category slides into those of the period left behind or entered into. Attending to those complex temporalities, let us theorize transition without presupposing linear stages. We can see combinations of old and new forms and dynamics, getting a better grasp of the alternative available. Sorry. Oh, no problem. I'm sorry Twitch is giving you trouble. I just got distracted because I kept on getting like freaking notifications. Features associated with one period or category slide into those of the period left behind or entered into. Attending to these complex temporaries lets us theorize transition without presuming linear stages. Wait, did I freaking skip something here? No, I didn't. Okay. We can see combinations of old and new forms and dynamics. Getting a better grasp of the alternatives available for contestation, we can identify tendencies without positioning a certain and inevitable historical telos. And we can recognize even in accounts presuming an eventual communism guidance for analysis what we went wrong. The complex temporalities of transitions to capitalism can tell us about transitions out of it. Whether in the gloomy direction of neo-feudalism or something more emancipatory and egalitarian. When we combine unevenness with the multi-directionality of transition, with the fact that things can get worse, we realize the unavoidability of politics. Without power, we will lose. Our enemies will fight back. Counter-revolution is real. Acknowledging this should not engender hopelessness and defeatism. It should remind us that communists fight because we must. We have a will to win. Neither linear nor stagist. Capitalist production has always coexisted with prior modes of production, as well as with non-bourgeoisie and non-capitalist ideologies, and practices such a feudal political and legal forms. Considering the United States, Marx underscores how slavery, instability, and past economic form, with indispensable to the capitalistic production of cotton for the world market, compounding civilized with barbaric horror, and thereby undercutting the concepts of the so-called civilized. Marx's political writing expresses a similar sense of the weight of traditions of dead generations. In the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, he famously says that men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. Elements from the past persist in the present, existing in the present. They are features of the present impacting human condition. The present doesn't erase the past. Sometimes it even perseveres it. Instability, obsolete economic forms can reappear. In a set of letters from December 1882, Engels wrote to Marx that he is glad that they proceed in agreement regarding the reappearance of serfdom in the 15th and 16th centuries after it had virtually disappeared in Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. Engels criticizes the historian George Ludwig von Meyer, whose work he had been studying, for presuming steady progress to begin things since the Middle Ages. Although it's common to present Marxism as a theory of history's march from slavery through feudalism to capitalism, socialism, and onward to communism, Marx and Engels resist reduction to a linear progressive theory of historical change. Especially in their later writing, capital does not overthrow feudalism, bursting loose from its fetters and establishing itself once and for all. Transition is extended, complex, uncertain, and reversible. Hello, the left Byria. How you doing? Welcome in. Lenin too resists reduction to linear history. Oh, Carlos, how you doing? Would you like to be mod, Carlos? Oh, that's fine. You can do mod on. Well, let's see here. Oh yeah, go back to the chat. There we go. Add as a mod. There you go. Lenin too resists. No problem. Lenin too resists reduction to linear history. I'll add you to the mod chat after this. His political moves in this regard are well known. His insistence that the Bolsheviks prepare for and led a socialist revolution in a country where capitalism had barely developed. His introduction of capitalism, the new economic policy, as a necessary technical retreat from the project of building socialism following the economic devastation of civil war. The premise of Lenin's theory of the state in the transition to communism is the endurance of bourgeoisie forms during the socialist phase, remnants of the old, starving in the new, confront us in the life at every step, both in nature and in society. His theory of imperialism highlights reversal. Capitalism becomes capitalist imperialism when certain of its fundamental characteristics began to change into their opposites. I always struggle with that word. No linearity here. No linearity here, yeah. Lenin's analysis of the emergence of capitalism in Russia, likewise, evinces an understanding of transition as open, complex, and honeycombed, of contradictory forms and tendencies. He detailed the differentiations among the Russian peasantry, upper, middle, and poor peasants, various form of ownership, labor extraction, and pavement, including wage labor. The persistence of the corrosive practice associated with serfdom after its official abomination in 1861. Lenin pays particular attention to the transition to capitalism or agriculture from the Krovy Barshchina form of agriculture labor. The Corvée system relied on peasants providing lords with labor services. Peasants held land and tools, but depended on access to the land that remained in the lord's possession. Land such as watering plant places, woods, and meadows. In principle, peasants agreed to work for the landlords in exchange for rights of access. Oh, hey Greg, how you doing? I'm glad you can make it. We're just reading into transition, so basically this chapter so far has been sums up. It was kind of like the transition between slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, then communism. That's kind of what we're reading about right now. I hope you're having a great day. In principle, peasants agreed to work for the landlords in exchange for rights of access. In practice, they were often directly coerced. The capitalist agricultural system relied on wage workers, whether hired seasonally or as day laborers. Yeah, I'm loving this chapter so far. Damn it. I always lose where I was. Whether hired seasonally or as day laborers, these peasant workers didn't use their own tools, and they had to work for hire, sell their labor power because they had no land, lacked means of subsistence. Important to Lenin's is less the distinction between the corvée and capitalist forms of agricultural labor than their coexistence during the transition to capitalism. The combination of dissimilar systems, he tells us, leads in practice to a whole number of most profound and complicated conflicts and contradictions. Lenin continues, Life creates forms that unite in themselves with remarkable gradualness systems of economy whose basic features can constitute opposites. It becomes impossible to say where labor service ends and where capitalism begins. Rosa Luxemburg argues that capital accumulation depends on non-capitalist social strata and forms of social organization. Marx has already emphasized the primitive accumulation at capital's origins, drawing out the violence of colonialism as well as domestic processes where producers were separated from the means of production. Luxemburg highlights capitalists' ongoing dependence on the outside that exportates through violent means, employing force as a permanent weapon. While Luxemburg attends to slavery and serfdom, her prime example is European colonial expansion, carried out by a relentless battle of capital against the social and economic ties of the natives, who are also forcibly robbed of their means of production and labor power. She looks closely at French colonialism in Algeria, British colonialism in India, China, and South Africa, and their forced removal and killing of indigenous people in the westward expansion of the United States. In all, the lesson is the same. The capitalist economy the capitalist economy develops in and depends on a non-capitalist outside that it violently subdues, and this very process of subjugation intensifies capital's imperialist lawless violence by rendering ever scarcer the outside of which capital depends. Maggie! Welcome in, Maggie. How you doing? We're reading a book here. It's great to see you. You're in pain? Oh no. Well, I hope you feel better soon. Hurt your neck? How'd you hurt your neck? You're always in pain. Oh, well. Well, I hope you get better soon. Focusing on colonialism in Africa, Walter Rodney deepens Luxemburg's argument. Capital doesn't simply depend on a non-capitalist or pre-capitalist outside that could potentially enter into the world trading system, eventually catch up. Oh, that sucks. I'm sorry to hear that. Capital, particularly in its imperialist phase, actively underdevelops huge parts of the world. What looks like forward development from the one angle is exploitation, oppression, and underdevelopment from another. Countries aren't simply at different stages along a path heading in one direction. Africa's integration into capitalism, world economy, is precisely what renders it exploited and dependent. Rodney is writing in earlier 1970s, a time when the capitalist epoch is not quite over. He observes that those who live in a particular moment particular point in time often fail to see that their way of life is in the process of transformation and elimination. Rodney thinks that the capitalist system is rapidly expiring. In the wake of the 50 years of socialist success, yet he warns that modes of production cannot simply be viewed as a question of successful stages. Not only has socialism not replaced capitalism, but capitalist exploitation of underdeveloped countries is expanding and intensifying their underdevelopment. Multiple political and economic forms coexist, but hardly peaceful. René Zavaleta Mercado shows how Spanish colonialism created a deeply integrated neural servile culture. In Bolivia, he considers that the unstoppable paradox of formerly capitalist sector in an environment that was not capitalist. The silver mines of Potosi that made European capital possible didn't make that regional capitalists. They produced for a world market, but not capitalistically. The mine's owners weren't capitalist in any strong sense. Their mentality was feudal, seigneurial, and mentally that becomes permanently insubscribed in the Bolivian oligarchy. Instead of reinvesting the surplus that the mines generate in improvements, the owners purchased massive amounts of land and built extravagant palaces. Labor relations weren't capitalist either. The vast majority of workers were indigenous people, directly constricted into forced labor, the infamous mita, and paid not in wages but in produced on the owner's land, in goods produced on the owner's land. Can Ahmad ban that, please? That's a bot. I can do it myself. Oh, thank you, Greg. Yeah, we don't play around with bots here. Zavaleta writes, it is responsible. Congratulations, everyone remembers their first band. Well, actually, that's not true. I don't remember my first band because I mod for a lot of channels. Zavaleta writes, it is responsible to maintain that from the very moment that Spaniards set foot on these lands, the most consistent pre-capitalist element is the theft of labor power. Mr. Blue, how you doing? No, it wasn't a chug medity. It was just a bot. The second most consistent is the theft of land. By the beginning of the 20th century, over 60% of the land in Bolivia was held by less than 10% of the people. A dramatic change from the middle of the 19th century, when 90% of the land was still owned by peasants. The legally enacted exportation of indigenous land led to something like a second serfdom. In contrast to the exportation of the English enclosure movement associated with the emergence of capitalism. Formerly free workers were now servile workers bound to the land. Zavaleta notes the fundamental difference between European feudalism and Bolivia's seigneurial system. The Bolivian system was constructed in the encounter with the Indian. He explains, employed Hegel, where there is no Indian, there is no lord. Racial differences functioned as a crucial element of subjugation. Society is founded on inequality, endless graduated hierarchies, ensuring that there is always someone lower in rank. The seigneurial aspect of the system also manifests in the fact that there is no lord without land. Land confirmed a title imagined to bestow a nobility akin to that of Spanish lords to those who were not Spanish lords, but who fetishized and fantasized their possession. Land was symbolic and reproductive, feudal rather than capitalist. Holding the land has a mystical quality, never fully adequate to the task of mitigating the racial uncertainty of the land-owning class. One last figure in the Marxist tradition of rejecting linear stages and recognizing a complex temporality of overlaps and reversals in Louis Althusser. In the post-humorously published Philosophy of the Encounter, he asked, "What proves that feudal mode of production declines and decays, then eventually disappears?" It was not until 1850 to 70 that capitalism established itself firmly in France. Above all, given that the bourgeoisie is said to be the product of the feudal mode of production, what proves that it was not a class of the feudal mode of production, and a sign of the reinforcements rather than the decay of this model? Althusser doesn't pursue this line. Rather than the considering a dialectic of decay and reinforcement, or of classes functioning on the behalf of seemingly opposed modes of production, he is interested in opening up the Eller tree in viewing transition as a matter of change encounters that may or may not take hold. His skepticism regarding feudalism, mythical decay is well found. Yet Althusser's conceptualization of modes of production as structures that impose their unity on a series of elements obscures the combinations and interactions of modes of production. It's as if he introduces the question of complex temporalities, of continuities and reinforcements that undermine and support, only to push it aside. As chance overrides decay, the opportunity to consider the overlaps of forms and logics is closed off in favor of a clear delineation of structures. Feudalism in its structure of dependence and capitalism with its structure of exploitation. I would, Maggie, but I don't really have much funny voices. That'd be interesting. This is I actually like post these videos to YouTube afterwards, so it's kind of like a learning thing. You know, I'm learning, everyone's learning. So, but maybe someday. I know. At a minimum, one might want to ask about forms of dependence on exploitation and the exploitation of dependence. Different modes of production can coexist, contributing to the reproduction of process and relations that they transform. Damn, this is a really good chapter. So now we're going into theorizing contemporary. Read like Queen Elizabeth. That would be funny. Historians Jaros Banerjee and Harry Haratunen give theoretical expression to the combinations and reversals of economic forms and logics that the Marxist tradition has long acknowledged. Emphasizing agrarian capitalism and the provincialism of Western Marxism, respectively, Banerjee and Haratunen drawn out the multiple differentiated and uneven trajectories of capitalist development. Their analysis highlight concepts useful for navigating complex temporalities and theorizing transition without presuming that history unfolds along a determining path of linear stages. Banerjee emphasizes the distinction between relations of production and forms of exploitation. He employs this distinction, which he finds in the Marxist tradition, in a critique of the Marxist tradition from vulgar Marxism in the 20s and 30s, through mid-century debates over the transition from feudalism to capitalism, to the 1970s debate between Iranzo Laclau and Andre Gunder Mark over underdevelopment in Latin America. Most significant for my discussion is Banerjee's emphasis on laws of motion. Much like Ellen Makeskin's would, Banerjee takes the view that modes of production cannot be defined in terms of specific labor processes. The same labor processes can be found in different modes of production. Commodity production appears in feudalism. Factory owners sometimes use serf labor. Slave plantations generate surplus values for capitalists. An enormous array of labor forms sustains feudal enterprises, not just serfs, but also part-time workers, free tenants, day laborers, and legally enslaved domestic workers. Capitalism likewise relies on coerced, unwaged, and unfree labor. Rather than being categorized by their mechanisms of surplus labor extraction, modes of production are differentiated by their underlying dynamics, their specific laws of motion, whereas capitalist production is driven by the imperative of accumulation, with its accompanying compulsions to compete and improve. My loyal subjects, I am your sovereign, your servant. Anyway, Karl Marx was the true G. Hell yeah, Maggie. The driver of feudal production is the consumption needs of lords. So even as free labor and commodity production appears under feudalism, and indeed, Banji argues that feudalism crystallized as commodity feudalism. What matters are the laws of motion behind the course shaped that feudalism takes, generating the cash needed to fund the lord's consumption. Banji drives out the repercussions of this emphasis on laws of motion for understanding colonialism, arguing that the colonization of Latin America was a feudal colonization, a response to the crisis of feudal profitability, which all the land-owning classes of Europe were facing down to the latter part of the 16th century. He rejects the dominant assumption that in the Lackalu-Frank debate, namely, that colonization was driven by the imperative of capital accumulation. Lackalu and Frank take for granted the laws of motion that an earlier generation of Marxists knew had to be discovered underneath empirical appearances, converting capitalism's point of arrival into points of departure. They failed to recognize how similar forms had radically different laws of motions. In Latin America and parts of South Asia, feudal estates produced commodities for national and international markets, as we already seen in Zavalita. In the West Indies, most of Africa and much of Asia, capitalist firms relied on archaic pre-capitalist modes of labor organization and generally stagnant levels of technique. While Marx recognized these intermediate hybrid forms, Banji points out that their persisted longer than the large-scale production typically associated with capitalism. A one-sided emphasis on forms of exploitation, coupled with the erasure of feudal laws of motion under the assumption of specifically capitalist motivation, blocks their differences from view, misrepresentation and misunderstanding each. Heroutin emphasizes fundamental substitution. As he explains, Marx's concept of formal substitution refers to the encounter of capitalism and received practices at hand. Labor practices beyond to a prior mode of production are resonated along and within newer capitalist demands to create value. Temporal unevenness thus occupies the heart of Marxist theory of capital accumulation. Neither a remnant nor an outside pre-capitalist or non-capitalist relations of exploitation are directly incorporated in capitalist production in the operation of formal substitution. The old is preserved as a precondition of the new. whereas many commenters view real substitution as the point when capitalist is fully established. Since this is when capital transforms labor process in order to generate surplus value. Harutian argues that for Marx, formal substitution is the key to capitalist development. Capital always appropriates what it finds on hand, subjugating older practices and institutions to its logic. Western Marxism, however, has fixated on real substitution, the commodification of everything, domination of the value form, and triumph of capital. The resulting image of achieved capitalist society in the West presumes a flattering uniformity, not only obscuring historical differences, but also disavowing capital's reliance on the unevenness it produces. Harutian endures to deprovincialize Marx by showing how thinkers beyond the industrial capitalist core use and develop Marxist categories to theorize unevenness. To this end, he reads Jose Carlos Margentini layered accounts of the unresolved land question in Peru. Margentini emphasizes not just the colonial implantation of feudalism, but also its reliance on extermination, slavery, and extractation, as well as its mutation into a present semi-feudalism, envisioning strata of economic forms one on top of each other. He sees the indigenous communities enduring traces of an Incan communism and corruptive tradition. Harutian writes, Martugi demonstrates how the semi-feudal mutation represents both the sign of formal substitution and the society it route into a permanent transition caught in the constant collision of past and presents that are never completed but always left open. Not a society distinguished by a polarization of opposites the successful overcoming of one by the other, nor the grand transition from a non-commodity community, feudalism, or any comparable tribal system to market society or one faithful to exchange. Formal substitutions retaining of the past renders transitions an open question, and process is never fully complete. The past isn't left behind, but promptly part of an ongoing transition, taking up debates over the development of capitalism in China and Japan. Harutian considers opposing interpretations of feudalism. Wang Yannin's charge that enduring feudalism provided a barrier to capitalist development in China, and Uno Kazu's argument that feudal resides benefited Japan's capitalism. While critical of Wang's reliance on a stages Marxist that smooths over a more astute treatment of unevenness, Harutian commends Wang's insight to the alignment of feudal structure and imperialism as a clear statement of logic of formational substitution. The very elements of traditional economy, that foreign capital was restructuring, in other words, that were being put to use in capitalist production, as operated as constraints on capitalist development. An uneven history bound together primitive and capitalist accumulation, freezing them in place. Uno's analysis of development in Japan also focused on the interplay of feudal and capitalist elements, from the ways that specific forms interact with and charge each other, to persistence of feudal state sentiments, and even after the demise of feudal societal relations. An argument akin to Salvalitas, far from a future specific Japan. The resistance of elements from the past into the present is a general feature of capitalism everywhere. The basic dynamic of form subsidization, where capital takes what it finds. Banji's and Herutain's insights into the dynamics of complex temporalities demonstrate ways of approaching transition without falling into stagism and determinism. That forms associated with one period exist in another doesn't mean they function in the same way or following the same laws of motion they once did. Capital embraces, absorbs, and capitalizes on feudal processes and relations. Formal subsidization is the bringing of old forms under a new logic. Feudal processes and relations may be fetters or on agents of capitalist development. Transition isn't a clean break. The persistence of past elements complicits clear descriptions of the past and holds the future in substance.